This is the final district term. The focus is domestic. Remember, you are required to look up the terms on the left, know what decade, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, write a summary, and have a general definition for each item. We're going to first start off with one of the significant political issues of the early 1970s, which was the Watergate scandal. And if we do not recall with the Watergate scandal, President Nixon was the president of the United States and was bombing in Vietnam as well, possibly as Cambodia. And this was released in the Pentagon Papers. The president tried to cover up his tracks by sending a group of people known as the Plumbers into the Watergate Hotel, which led to the president being accused of numerous charges, one in particular, obstruction of justice. Before getting impeached, the president opted to resign from his position, and then Gerald Ford, the guy on the right, would become the next president of the United States and would issue Nixon a pardon. This topic right here has come up several times, and it is the oil shortage. If we do not remember, after World War II, Israel was created. Surrounding Arab countries attacked Israel. So we'll put over here, this will be the Arab, this will be the Israeli side. And by the time it gets to the 1970s, there seems to be a lot of Arab support, which is when the organization of OPEC comes into play, and Arab possessing oil states decide that they're going to manipulate the supply of oil, which is going to force the cost of oil up, as well as gasoline. And they're trying to get a resolution to this issue here, which leads to a series of long lines and inflation in the United States as a result of the oil shortage. During the 1970s, the United States car manufacturers would try to create cars that are more efficient than the Japanese cars, like this old Honda Civic here. Remember, Americans were used to the 8-cylinder engines, which use a lot of fuel, and these smaller vehicles could have 3 or 4 cylinder engines, which means it uses half the amount of fuel. And you start to see, as a result of that oil crisis, Japanese car manufacturers playing a role in the American auto industry. Apollo 11 really an issue from the late 60s, where the United States gets someone, gets human beings landed on the moon. And this leads to the end of the space race, acknowledging that the United States won. If you remember, Kennedy made the promise to get someone to the moon. During the 1970s, the presidents of the United States, as mentioned before, Nixon, Ford, and then Jimmy Carter. We have a Republican, and then Carter being the Democrat. The 1970s was plagued with environmental issues as well as what would be called stagflation. And one of the environmental issues was the 3 Mile Island. For the most part, the United States was in the area of trying to build series of nuclear power plants for energy efficiency and clean energy. And when 3 Mile Island wound up experiencing their nuclear disaster, this led to less support nationally as well as politically for nuclear power plants. In the 1970s, 1980s, we start to see an increase of Asian migration. During the 1920s, we looked at this political cartoon. And what's going on here is that there's a lot of migration coming to the United States. And here we see 3%. The quota system put in place restrictions. Certain countries were not allowed to send once they exceeded their quota, which is why in the 1920s we had, I think it was like 13 million European immigrants in comparison to about 250,000 from Asia. And it's not until 1965 that that quota system was reversed as a result of the JACL working to try to reverse that ruling. The Trade Center was in development during the 1970s, would be completed in 1974. Here we see the completion. This is the North Tower, this is the South Tower, and the architect Minoru Yamasaki, who was around during World War II, as it says right here, avoided World War II internment camps. He was the architect selected for the unique design of the Trade Center. We also start to see in the 1980s the discussion that leads to abuse in medical facilities. And here we see an image from Pennhurst in Pennsylvania, where people were looking at the treatment of people put in these institutions, which led to overcrowding and patient abuse. And what that's about is looking at, how many people, let's say you have, 12 patients, and then you have one person, nurse, who's there to take care of them. That's going to lead to overcrowding. If the facility can hold 100 people and now you have 150, they're definitely not going to get the adequate security because they're just going to be overextended. In the 1980s, Reagan would become president, giving the presidency back to the Republicans, and Carter's administration was plagued with a series of issues. One, the economy, inflation, stagflation, as well as the Iran-Contra affair. And he would not win in the election, leading to the Republicans gaining control. And one of the reasons Reagan would win is because the continued fight between the left and right that started with the civil rights movement. By the time you get to the 70s, you see like Roe v. Wade, you start to see gay rights coming up, you start to see abortion starting to go up, decline in marriage, and all of these issues are important for the religious right, which is why they attach themselves to Reagan and the Republican Party, and that trend still is today. In the 1980s, you would see the post-Vietnam portrayal of Vietnam vets through movies and TV shows where Vietnam vets were portrayed as crazy, sometimes homeless, like in the film Rambo, and sometimes criminals, like in the TV show A-Team. Post-traumatic stress disorder is part of every war. It's how the mind mentally adjusts to times of war. One guy in particular was the TV show The Fall Guy with a bounty hunter stuntman who was also a Vietnam vet, but this individual actually was mentally fit, didn't seem to be homeless, didn't seem to be crazy in the portrayal. But again, this is about how Vietnam vets were portrayed. Many of them were homeless. The conservative movement, already mentioned a little bit about this particular movement here. Here we see, again, the left versus right, the issues that are going to concern people who are religious to align themselves with the Republican Party, which would argue they would try to do something about abortion and try to reinstate family values. While Reagan was president, his presidency dealt with Reaganomics. Reaganomics is this idea that government gives money to major companies, and those major companies hire people. And when they hire people, that's how the government indirectly gets money to the people. This is a complete opposite of what happened during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the government gave money directly to people. The end result, though, this led to inflation and the prices of everything just went up. In the 1980s, we come back to the issue of poverty. I don't want you to think that the 1970s was not the only decade dealing with poverty. 1970s, 1980s, 80s, there was some change as a result of some technological advances, but for the most part, you still experience a high level of poverty in the 1980s. You also had this trend where, as a result of unions going down, you now had a situation where mom and dad both needed to work in order to provide for the nuclear family and the American dream. Prior, the assumption was that the male would be the only one out working. AIDS and the gay cancer, another issue that angered the right. And what's going on here is that the AIDS epidemic is starting to take place. Nobody quite knows where it's coming from. There was this belief that mosquitoes, you could get this from a toilet, you could get this from using a public phone. What they did know is it seemed to be killing gay men in great numbers, which is why it got the label gay cancer. The Reagan administration, as a result of its alignment with the conservative party, with the religious right, the some people in America felt that he did not do anything to address the issue of AIDS because it was impacting primarily gay Americans. The institutionalization, what's going on here is you're starting to see the trend where institutions, people who have medical conditions, here are all of the patients, they are starting to have the conversation about sending them back into their homes so they are not just living their lives in medical facilities. By the time we get to the 90s, you would see the presidency of Clinton and Gore. And Gore is vice president. And before Clinton, you did see Bush, who was in president, GW. And his presidency was associated with the Iraq War. And then Clinton would come in, and Clinton would probably come in at a lucky time when the internet is starting to become an issue and the economy would be saved as a result of that dot-com boom that took place. However, his presidency also experienced some scandals. One in particular was the Clinton impeachment. And the Clinton impeachment was all about this intern right here that was accused of having some sort of relationship with the president. When the president was asked, he said no, and his no was under oath, which led to a situation where they were trying to impeach him because he had lied under oath. The presidency also dealt with the topic of gays in the military and passed the policy of don't ask, don't tell, which simply meant you could be in the military as a homosexual. You just could not tell anyone, nor could you be asked. So I could not ask you if you were a homosexual in the military. You could not tell me. If either of us violated it, we would be removed from the military experience. In 1990, as you start to see the um, origin of some of the militia groups, and militia groups were groups of people who were upset with the federal government. One of the issues primarily was about abortion. And in this situation here with the David Koresh, as well as the killing of Ruby Ridge, these were all examples in the minds of the militia groups that the federal government was waging a war on the American people. And the Oklahoma City bombing was a federal building that was attacked by Timothy McVeigh, and it was designed to get back at the government that the militias felt was overstepping. 2000 disputed election, Al Gore versus Bush. And when Bush would, this is not the same Bush before Clinton, this is the Bush, the son. Uh, the disputed election led to a situation where the electoral college map was very close, but in Florida, you had the issue where there was a ballot dispute, and those electoral votes would wind up going to the winner, which was then challenged, and then the Supreme Court ruled that there was no tampering, which led to the president going to Bush. In the 1990s, the ADA was signed, and this was going to allow civil rights for people with disabilities. One of the challenges to this was the Olmstead versus LC, where they're looking at segregation of people with disabilities. And normally, when we think segregation, we primarily think about racial segregation, but is it segregation if you are isolating people with disabilities? That seems to be the question here. By the time we get to 9/11 in 2001, we would see the 9/11 attacks take place. Al Qaeda starting to organize in the 90s and would send a group of 19 hijackers into the United States to commit an act of terrorism on the Trade Center. Here we see the North Tower getting hit. If you were to click these links, it would take you to some of that footage. Americans were caught trapped in the buildings and could not get out, especially if they were above the impact zone, which led to the creation of Homeland Security. And Homeland Security was the government response to 9/11, which allowed the federal government additional power. Also, the Patriot Act, which allowed the federal government to spy on Americans, especially if they suspected them of terrorism. We would also experience the Hurricane Katrina disaster where New Orleans was flooded. Here we see people indicating that they're inside to save them. In the 2008, you would experience the housing crisis as well as the Great Recession. These are linked. In the 90s, President Clinton wind up eliminate some restrictions on home loans. Before you were buying a home, you needed a 20% down payment. Now you needed zero. What this did was in the late 90s, early 2000s, it brought up the price of homes. Many Americans took out loans for 0%, temporary, and then they could not pay those loans back when those loans then went up to like 6%, which led to a bunch of homes being left abandoned, which led to the '08 crisis. And that's it for this slideshow.